have to say that probably, human beings, part of the human part of the human experience is actually, whether we like it or not, conditioning ourselves to respond to images.
Hey everyone, I'm ML Reynolds, and this is Examined, a space to weigh what we think, question what we know, and trace the threads that hold our understanding together. Each conversation is an invitation to dig into challenging ideas and explore new perspectives, and hopefully come away seeing things a little bit differently. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today. Just for the sake of everybody who's going to be watching this, Andy is an incredible archivist with the Ernie Pyle Museum and also with Candles Museum. And he took up photography just a few years ago, and I've never seen somebody become so good at it so fast. And he has this enormous collection of work, if you will. It's going to be a library unto itself in the end that will need archiving. And it covers everything from history in terms of what's happened in the past to what's happening in our present, which will become somebody else's history. And uh, we're going to talk a lot about this today, just finding out about what drives all of his interests and skills and how that connects with how he sees the world. So thank you, Andy.
You're
So
welcome.
just to get us started here, do
Yeah,
you care to just tell a little bit about yourself?
yeah. Thanks for asking. I'm kind of one of the unusual people that you might meet in terms of background. I was born in Taiwan, adopted by American missionaries when I was at the age of 2, moved around to multiple different places in the world, Philippines, Haiti. Now I reside in the United States. And, one of the things I've pointed out that's rather bizarre in my biography is that, well, I'm an immigrant. I am a naturalized immigrant because I wasn't born here. The Chandler family that I was adopted into, they've been around in the country since like 1627. So there's a really kind of an interesting perspective on Americana that I have, being an outsider, but also being somebody who's privy to the inside. That's the long and the short of it. I also, like you mentioned, I'm an archivist. I am a photographer, and I'm a very happy husband. And that's probably the gist of it. And just overall, overtly curious individual. A lot of people will probably mistake the international flavor I have going to international festivals as curiosity, but I like to point out that it's more in my blood. Just because when you move to a different location, we did the math on. I think it was before I was the age of 20. I lived in like 15 different places, and my wife could testify that it took me 4 years of living in this house where I actually unpacked the last suitcase. So I'm not used to sticking around too long, but eventually, I think now that I'm in middle age, I think the gig is up, and I do need to kind of sit down, plant some roots, and just kind of just enjoy life. That's probably the best introduction I can give you right off the bat.
That said, you have been known to jump into your car and go to different places. Um, I want to talk first about the fact that because your parents were missionaries, you traveled a lot to different countries. And I was fascinated by the fact that you said that your family chose to live in the community and not sequestered away in some sort of compound, which often happens when you live in certain countries. So I want to ask about the relationships that you were able to form and how that has shaped you.
I still have. Great example. Guy's name is James Shao, and now he is a full bird colonel in the United States Army. But he and I actually met. We used to play. We used to play on the streets when I was in Taiwan. We used to bike around, and he and I just became really good friends, and we've had that friendship ever since. I guess you could say it kind of started with my dad because he was born in. I was actually born in the United States. It barely made it home from the Japanese invasion of China. But when
Oh
they
my.
finally went back to to China back in 1945, that family lived off campus as well, off compound as well. So that was in his blood. And so and it was actually said of my grandfather, although I've never heard a recording of his voice, he died before I was born, that if you had talked to him in Mandarin, you would not know that he was actually a Chinese Mandarin second speaker. That's how good he
Wow.
was. My dad was very much the same thing, and what we had observed, what I was observing constantly, would be that he was such a memorable person, and he had established good friendships that even after 10, 12 years, when we left, after we were left Haiti, when we came back in '04, people still remembered him. He'd still established those friendships. So I don't know if it's something I can really comment too much when it's second nature. But I was always raised to just be in cultures. I remember when I was a public safety officer in Indianapolis, I got my badge, and my pulled me aside and he said, "I want you to remember that you 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 were a missionary kid. We were guests in other people's country, and no matter how important you think you are in this world, when you're out in the field, you will never be anything more than a guest in somebody else's life. So behave." And so I think that if there was a lesson that he imbued,
Yeah.
is to always conduct myself as a guest,
Yeah.
because even while we were in the community, we knew that we were different. We knew that we had to behave ourselves and respect the fact that these cultures and these relationships and these communities were around far before we have.
I mean, I could see how that is going to give you some advantages as a photographer because you're walking in as a guest in someone else's community. So, if you want to comment on that just briefly, I mean, we're going to ask another question after this, but I think there's a nice flow there that I don't want to skip over.
It's become more so in the last year or so. I think
Yeah.
it's dangerous when especially when you're a reporter, which I'm also a
Right.
journalist as well. When you're a reporter, it's kind of like I see one of the dangers I think I see in a lot of people who are reporters nowadays is they view themselves as being very self-important because we're reporting on the news. Like no one would ever know about you if we weren't here. I don't. I've seen it before, but I don't. I fail to see how that idea is productive. So, from a journalistic perspective, I do have to ask permission probably more than I used to, just because of the political nature, also the nature of AI. You don't want to take a photo of somebody, even if you have every right to take a picture. Who's to say that if I took a photo of some gentlemen who are Spanish speaking playing a soccer game, that AI wouldn't pick up on something and
Right.
put them in danger? Who's to say that the mother on the subway that I take a photo of with her kids isn't fleeing a domestic issue? So even if I can say, yeah, I have a right to do this because I'm a photographer, those are how we lose credibility, but that's also how we lose access, and that happens very as far as out on the streets, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's as easy as just a simple nod and just kinda showing people the camera. I'll tell you what, most of the time, people are really cool, especially if they know that you're there and they know that you had the courtesy to respect them enough to ask the question.
So true. And I forgot. I mean, the photo behind you is one that you've taken recently. It's very important to note that your flavor of photography is journalism specifically. Hence I think I implicit connection was with Ernie Pyle, who's excellent at that, and your
Mhm.
relationship with the Ernie Pyle Museum. But you're very good at capturing that aspect of it. So there is that telling of the story that's happening as a journalist. So I think we've caught a little bit on your background. Do you want to comment about some of these different roles that you've played, especially with Candles and Ernie Pyle, and as a journalist or anything else in terms of what informs you?
What informs me? I think most people would be really shocked that I didn't really know much about the Holocaust or about World War II going into these gigs as an archivist. It was, something about my life I'd gotten married, was kind of going through my midlife discovery process. And one day, basically, somebody, site director, Trent Andrews is his name. He kind of saw, hey, you're good at history. You know a lot about history. We may need somebody who can have that instant recall, at least to help us out here, as long as you're okay as a volunteer. So it was something that just quite quickly get me out of the house. My wife has a in-home daycare, so it was kind of something to get me away from all the screaming children. And you know, I think after about a month or so, I realized, I kind of enjoyed this. This is really a lot of fun, just being able to understand people's lives. Also, I think that when you are speaking about being in a missionary environment, you're speaking about people that like to present themselves in a specific way, whether it's missionaries presenting themselves in a certain way, whether it's mission fields presenting themselves in a certain way for more, and it's always an ulterior motive. It's just the dark side of mission work. And so there's always this knowledge that there's kind of a truth beyond what we see. And so that was kind of feeding into that as an archivist, because we have that narrative, but we can add so much more to that narrative by just going into an archives and finding certain letters. I'll use an example. Ernie Pyle is mostly known for his World War II work, especially the World War
Right.
II work regarding the D-Day invasion, the D-Day landings, which the movie Pressure just came out today. I'm going to go see it this evening. Most people don't realize that he actually did not even he had agreed with his wife he wouldn't even go ashore. He had actually almost been killed back in January of the same year. Oddly enough, it's the one time that cigarettes became like smoking a cigarette to save you, because he went outside of his room to go have a smoke, and a bomb parked itself right in his sleeping bag and detonated.
Dang.
So, I mean, he missed out by maybe 20 seconds, but he and his wife had said, "No, I'm not gonna do this." He ends up doing it, but then he has to do I think it's mansplaining. He has to explain to his wife, "Hey, I know we had this agreement, but let me tell you why I didn't hold to my end of it," because he realized, "Wait a minute, in 5 days' time, she's gonna figure this one out. She's gonna read the columns. She's gonna know." And
Yeah.
so that's a subs now it doesn't add or detract, but it does enhance the story of what we already know of his time there. Archivists are good at researching, but we're also good at finding those little nuggets that people don't actually know, and that's what fascinates me.
And that's the fun part about getting to talk to you. So I like that part. um, and you explained why you began relationships with, for people who don't know, Candles is Eva Core's. It's not a very large Holocaust museum. It's in Terre Haute. It's very worth your stop if you're on your way through Indiana. Everyone should go there. Eva Kor was one of a set of identical twins who survived all of the horrible experiments.
Yeah, there were like 3,000 twins that they were able to 3,000 twins, also individuals who were subject to dwarfism that were experimented on at the
Yes.
time. That was 3,000 pairs. So we're talking about possibly 6,000, and I'm not even including triplets. Of those, I believe the number that survived, she's got the file is in her records, but I think it was like 219 pairs survived the Holocaust after that. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty drastic attrition rate. Remarkably higher than I thought it would be, to be honest with you. The pairs that she was able to track down came out to like about 200, 250. But
It's
the
fun.
story behind her is that she ended up forgiving all the Nazis, which kind of is a very controversial act even in today's world. That is something that is still being debated. We get a lot of reactions at the museum to that from people who are from the Jewish community that have very strong opinions about that. Trust me, I've gotten an earful.
Yeah, I imagine you have. And I'm going to include in the drop it or in the notes. My husband has interviewed you as well. I believe he dropped in it when you were at Candles. And I think it's well worth that listen to explore a little bit more about your work that you've done with that. What did you find fulfilling, though, about choosing these two museums and working with them?
So we're talking about two separate museums here that have two separate raison d'etres. We had a scenario. I think for Candles, it's been wonderful just networking with the communities, networking with the museum curation community, also with the Jewish community. I was talking to one gentleman, and he and I corresponded over a set of artifacts that he had had, and he gave me a compliment one day that absolutely just put me in tears. And he just basically said, "Thank you. You are one of the righteous among us." And
Wow.
knowing what that
What
term
they,
means really meant the world to me because they understood that I was trying to preserve the memory, which also
yeah.
is very orthodox. For the Ernie Pyle Museum, I think it's more interesting because it's two things. Really, we're looking at two different raison d'etres in that. I think that's how you pronounce it. One is obviously we're looking at really trying to really get the community to be proud of itself.
Hmm.
Vermilion County's taken a hit. I mean, I think in the last 10 years, it's lost a third of its population. But
Dang.
I think at the same time, this community has a lot to be proud of. And you can see a lot of the county and a lot of the values in the county in his writings. And so one of the joys has been to basically help people understand how proud they should be that somebody like him, a Pulitzer Prize, a guy who really was at the avant-garde of the embedded journalism genre, that he was actually one of the ones that came from that. And to be able to point specifically to certain instances where they can identify as okay, that value came from this community. So that's been helping a lot about helping community pride. Also, working with other journalists. I think
Right.
that there is well, my opinion, controversial as it is, I don't think that Pyle would survive in today's journalistic world. I think in many ways that he was uh, he was too embedded with people. He has some amazing letters between him and Eisenhower and him and Omar Bradley where they're just buddies. And it's very, that's kind of taboo nowadays is to be buddies with your subject. And so that's one of those it's kind of a gray area because most journalists will say, no, you shouldn't do this. At the same time, the goal is to get to truth. And sometimes if you have to open up the truth, you have to kind of embrace the subject. So that can get really messy after time. Also, you're in a situation where you do have to report in a certain way because today's journalists would say, no, the government should not dictate what I do. We look at CBS, great example of what's happening there. However, at the same time, The question also is, do you want access? 80 years ago, most journalists would have said, okay, I want access. I can spot specifically to the one case where Patton slapped the guy. And that didn't actually come out until about 2 or 3 weeks after the event. And there was a real big huddle between the journalists of should we report this or not? Is it going to hurt our relationship with the government? Is it going to hurt the government's cause? What do we do here? And so eventually one person decided that they were going to go ahead and do it. I think this was the New York Times. I forget his name now. Might have been Don Whitehead from the New York Times from might have been. But at the same time, those issues being wrestled are still issues, being wrestled today, especially in today's current political climate. So I think that going over and looking at his writings really made me understand, okay, this is nothing new, but how are we going to deal with it? What should we deal with? What's important? And I can't give answers. I can't give generalizations, but at the same
Right.
time, this is ground that's already been trod before. I'm able to just go in and find it.
It makes me wish I was still teaching my journalism classes because I would have you come in and talk about that issue of reciprocity, boundaries, self disclosure, all of that when it comes to the curating a good relationship with sources. Because you obviously don't want to just come at the source with some level of absolute disdain or distance, because in that case, what's the win? For them to talk to you. We have to have a
Mhm.
strong relationship, but we should have a level of credibility and good rapport with our sources, right?
Absolutely. Well, we all say that too. The other thing I kind of want to mention, and you'll be kind of
Yeah.
shocked at this. I've never had a journalism class. I've never did. The only journalism class that I ever had was it was me and about 8 boxes of Ernie Powell's writings, as well as about 4 books
Right.
and anthologies. So in many ways, I'm probably his most recent student, which is kind of ironic because he never graduated from IU. He was 1 semester short. So
Mhm.
it's kind of an interesting dynamic for people to note there. But I think just understanding his syntax, just understanding that whole existential tell it like it is
Yeah.
really affected me. Like I said, it was one of those things that kinda came naturally to me,
Right.
kinda like photography. But no,
Yeah.
I never had a photography class either.
And let's go to that. You had when we first know we've known each other for a while. I should disclose that. And I want to say that we're both Orthodox Christians, hence the reference to the orthodoxy. And I want to address the fact that when we first met, you sort of described yourself as a historian. Of course, you've done so many different varied things, which might make you a very good historian because you're able to draw connections together. But then when you actually post a lot under the term feral historian. But now as a photojournalist, I'm curious how you hold the balance and which one is tipping in which direction right now.
I don't see much of a difference, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
As much I see now, I mean, some people can go both ways on that one, but, I've wrestled with this question, am I one or the other?
Mhm.
I generally don't want to engage in a dichotomy that I think may be unhealthy. So that's kind of one of those things
Right.
I wouldn't have actually wanted to have said I'm one or the other. What I will say this, we have a book in Candles. It is by the BBC, and it
Okay.
actually showed some pretty graphic photos of the Holocaust. Well, at the beginning, it had a disclaimer that simply said, "We wrestled with whether we should have published this or not, but we felt that the public should know."
Right.
And that was in the introduction to the book. And so I think that a good historian makes a good journalist. A good journalist makes a good historian. That's why it's probably some of the best journalists, probably some of the best historians that we can look at right now. The ones that aren't academic historians, but the ones that don't have PhD next to their names. I'm talking about John Meacham, Nancy Gibbs, former editor for New
Mhm.
York Times. Also, what's his name? Moore. He was the one that wrote the book Landslide about Donald Trump's last day in office. I forget his name now. Some of the best books have been coming out about presidential history in the last 10, 15 years have actually been from
Right.
reporters. And they actually have the best access, better than most historians do. So I think that no, I think I don't really feel that distinction should probably that dichotomy should exist. What I can say in some ways that I think is different from me, and this is probably one of the benefits of actually being at a paper versus being something that just feeds on the internet constantly, is I don't have to write for clicks.
That's true.
And which means I can actually take my time to actually do things right. When I have done interviews, normally I wait about 3, 4, 5 days before it comes out. And actually, my wife, because I am ESL, she generally reviews it. There's been, I think, at least 3 or 4 times where she's actually gone toe to toe with me and said, "Hey, buddy." you need to be careful if you put that in there or not. That doesn't add or detract to the story, but it makes them look really bad, and it does nothing for it. So there have been
Mhm.
some times when she's given me criticism, and she bats at pretty much 100 that that's 100 on that. The only thing that she will never get me to agree with is I still think that the Oxford comma is useless. So
Well,
no,
you're
so
lucky.
yeah,
As a
I know
journalist
I get it.
as a journalist for a paper, you don't have to use it.
I don't.
They got great piece.
I'm very glad that, at dinner the other night, it was basically, what, 3 against 1, so I'm glad that we outvoted her on that. She didn't
It's
take it
one of
too well.
those things. That's good, that's good. Well, yeah, and you said there's not a lot of difference between those 2 things. I've got a couple questions I could follow up with. One of them
I'll add
is what
actually
makes
one
them
thing
the
real quick.
same. Go ahead.
The one thing that you can report the news. I think that there are 2 things that guide me throughout the
Yeah.
process, and 2 things that have been very important. Number 1, I think that I may have a puristic view of democracy just because I grew up in the shadow of communism, that people are intelligent and people are blessed with brains and can make up their minds. And the job of a journalist isn't really to shape that opinion, it's just to present the facts and let them make the decision. I'm reminded of Samuel Tilden, the man who actually lost in the popular vote to Rutherford B. Hayes. At the foot of his grave is a phrase that just says, I still trust the people. And so I do
Mhm.
trust. I love America. I'm naturalized, but I trust the people enough to make the decisions. I just provide them the information. That's point number 1. Point number 2,
Good.
writing for an audience of 80 years from now. I showed you some of the photos earlier of the starvation cell at Auschwitz.
Yeah.
But I've also seen some of the photos that were taken during that time at Auschwitz. And we wouldn't know what we know about Auschwitz without those photos, without the descriptions. But I bet you those people that took those photos or had those descriptions didn't think that some nerd from Taiwan was going to be poring over them 80 years later. So I don't know who's going to be looking over my work 80 years from now, 100 years from now. But I hope if the technology still exists to get the photos off databases and stuff like that, that people can take the body of work that I've left and be able to use it. I just simply don't. I don't believe I will ever see the day when people will sit back and say, "Well, I appreciated that." So those are probably 2 things I really wanted to make clear about my philosophy behind journalism.
I like that. I'm gonna go back to that comment that where your wife is pressing back on you about parts of your writing that don't leave a person in good light. Would you say that it's the tone of your writing, or are you finding yourself withholding details that someday, if you trust the people, they should be aware of?
I can tell you exactly. I'll tell you exactly an instance that it happened, and now that now that I've said it, the secret will be out. This was actually with regards to the lieutenant governor of the state, because if you've noticed occasionally, if you look at the sessions, he twirls the gavel on his fingers. And I made a comment to him. I said, "Hey, should we put up a GoFundMe page to purchase 2 other gavels so that you can stop juggling?" And he says, "Well, actually, no, but I do get text messages occasionally from my friends while I'm up there saying, hey, can you do the gavel twirl? Because we're all bored now." And so I was originally going to put that in the article, but my
Mhm.
wife is like, nah, it doesn't do anything to first of all, it makes him look like,
Right.
like he's just honestly doesn't take what he's doing seriously, number 1. And number 2, it really doesn't do anything to the article whatsoever. It's not beneficial. And so there have been times when I've done that, or occasionally I quoted a line about the Congressional Medal of Honor. No, actually, I made a quote recently about the Nobel Peace Prize and about how it was actually earned by a vice president, and one of his lackeys didn't have to actually, give it to him as a gift. This was a vice president that was back in 1920. But I made
Mhm.
that comment. She goes, "Hey, dude, they're gonna. I know what you meant, and I feel the same way. But they're gonna come after you if that goes into trend. So you might want to consider striking that one. I know where you went with that one. Probably not a good idea to go that direction. So I don't feel like she's actually ever. She has neither added or detracted to the story in terms of its
Right.
essence or form.
I really appreciate that because almost all pieces, even your wife as your sort of editor here, go through a level of vetting about, hey, where are we facing when we're thinking about our audience? And what do they need to know about this person versus what do I want to communicate but probably shouldn't? Again, insertion of a little bit of your personality, or not your personality, but your opinion on that latter piece, right? You're revealing a little bit about ourselves, which does show up more in journalism these days.
May
It's
not be a good thing
interesting.
either.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we need to be honest about the fact that it does, and then give people permission to be a little more critical as readers if we're going to do it, like explicitly for each piece, or more so than we do. I Too many people are confused where the line is between the reporter's personal stance and what the story is actually about and what it's actually supposed to be communicating. Of course, there is a level of subjectivity in everything, and I'm going to use this as my transition point, so bear with me. I want to ask you, you've traveled all over. You and your wife both have traveled all over, sometimes together, sometimes separate. You take a lot of
Mhm.
pictures along the way. I have seen a number of your pictures, including what you took for Emmett Till, which resonated a lot with me because I used to teach a lot about Emmett Till. You've gone to reenactments. A recent set of your photos were absolutely phenomenal. Protests to Gaza, again, another set of memorable photos. And if I can, I'd like to at some point share the photos that you sent over from going to Pope Leo's old church.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna pull that up on the screen. And then I'm gonna ask you, I mean, if you wanna comment on that at that point, that's great. But after that, I'm gonna ask you why you choose where you go. So can you see am I sharing now successfully? Share. No. Here we go.
Yes,
Just
I do now.
okay.
Kinda, kinda,
Kinda. What does
possibly.
that mean?
Ah, there we go.
Okay, little things moving out of the way. All right, let's get those out of
Let
the
me
way.
pop that real quickly. There we go. There we go.
Jeez. Will you speak
Yes.
to what you're seeing here? Yeah.
Mhm. Why, what? Say what?
Will you speak to what the context is? You Why did you choose to go to this place and tell a little bit of that story behind this photo?
So a little bit about this actually. I never choose short answers, which you will find probably aggravating at times. I know my wife does. But at the sake of over explaining, when you travel to different places, especially if you're going to visit somebody's where they grew up, you learn a lot about people. I remember I I remember back in 2020, I was actually screaming at cattle in a place called, it's called s yeah, it's called Fredericksburg, Texas, which is where, Lyndon Baines Johnson's ranch was, but I was screaming at cattle and yelling at
Yeah.
them because they were in the middle of the road. I wanted them out so I could keep driving. And it dawned on me why he would scream at senators and congressmen. Why and so those are the kind of things like,
Ah.
okay, he thinks that they're cattle that he can just order around. That's the infamous Johnson. That's when it clicked that, okay, you will always learn more about somebody when you see where they grew up. It just happens to
Okay.
be that in the case of Pope Leo, where he grew up was about 2.5 hours away from where I am. This is the first time in the 2000 something year history of the church. It's the second time we've had a pope from the Americas, but the first time we've ever had a pope from the North America, let alone the
Right.
Midwest, let alone Chicago. But yeah, that was a no-brainer. I think I actually had left the house, ran out to my car before I actually knew what I was supposed to be doing. What I should not be doing, what I shouldn't have been doing was actually looking at maps and doing research while I was driving down, State Road 41. That being said, you kind of know what you need to do. In this case, this was an unusual situation because it was a it was breaking news. I knew from my experiences having traveled to different birthplaces and different childhood homes of US presidents and other VIPs, I knew what I needed to do. I knew what was important. Go visit the parents' grave. That was my very first stop that day. Go to the childhood
Okay.
home. That was my second
Yeah.
stop that day. Then I actually got out of my car, left it at the family home. Bolton Riverdale area is not a good side of town. It's the south side of Chicago, and back in the day, it was a little bit different than it is now. But I decided I was going to go for a walk and walked a little bit of the way to the train tracks. Realized it was going to be a little bit longer. Got my car, drove over to the church where he had actually served and also where he went to school. And so what had happened at that point was there were about the church was being decommissioned and it was actually in private ownership, but the owner was there and he had actually met with the other members of the press. About four or five of us reporters were there first on the scene, which was really cool because while I was there, CNN showed up. So I
Oh,
kind of
wow.
always like to brag about the fact that I showed up before CNN and before AP showed up, that I had the foresight to think, okay, maybe we might want to go do this. Then, yeah, I mean, he invited us in. And at that time, I was actually with another reporter. His name was Kurt. He's from Kansas City. And we
Okay.
basically buddied up. And he goes, it's not smart to walk into an abandoned building on the south side of Chicago. And this sanctuary is probably one of 5 buildings on a 4 or 5-acre compound on the south side of Chicago that's all abandoned. What could possibly go wrong?
I'm gonna share
So
some other pictures, by the way. I'll bring them
yeah,
up.
but
Go
it
ahead.
was really kind of interesting to know that, hey, this is the place where his mind was formed, where he probably learned Greek and Latin in these, yeah, where he probably learned Greek and Latin in these halls. This is the sanctuary where he served. He was an altar server, and so that was kind of it was an amazing experience, and being able to write about it. It was actually kind of amusing because it was the first time. Okay, that I'll explain that photo in a second because that's the photo
Okay.
that really when it kind of clicked what my
Yeah.
goal was supposed to be. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that I had just come back a few months earlier from Auschwitz, and
Yeah.
there had been a moment where I actually was about to put down the camera for good. It was just too
Mhm.
much. It will get to you, but the longer you wait to let it get to you, the harder it's gonna come. And it
Yeah.
was about a month after Auschwitz, and I kind of almost had what amounts to a nervous system breakdown. So I'd done some stuff with like Women's International Women's Day, the Hands Off rally, but this was the first time that I really said, "Okay, you know what? This is mine. This isn't an assignment. I'm doing this because people will want to know 100 years from now what this day felt like." And so, in that moment, you kind of put yourself off to the background and you let your 5 senses kick in. I mean, I can still smell the mustiness of the hallways. I can still feel the uncertainty with every footstep I was taking. But what I remembered about this, and if you go back to the color photo, which is very rare for me to actually take a colored photo,
Yeah.
while we were there, we were in such awe of what we were doing that I think every one of us were just astonished where we were. And it was kind of fun because it was the local newscasters, because the international newscasters, CNNs, NBCs, they were outside doing their doing their reporting while we were on the inside, just exploring and just in awe of everything. And during the meantime, that gentleman's actually, he's experiencing homelessness. I still have his number, actually. I'm definitely gonna tell him to look at this interview. But he just came and he just stopped. He just stopped and just looked at the stained glass windows, looked at the ceiling, and that was, you get so busy and you get so tunnel visioned as to what you're supposed to be doing. Sometimes you just forget to stop and enjoy the moment. And so, here's a guy who is experiencing a lot of difficulty in life, just doing something which I had forgotten to do, which was just to kind of stop and enjoy things. And so that photo still sticks with me to this day because he was just very reverent. I have a home, I'm married. I have what amounts to 2 jobs. I'm very blessed. And here's a gentleman who's not very well, in society's eyes, maybe he's not blessed. But we were all in awe of the moment we were in, and that I guess one can say spiritually that at that moment we were all in awe of being in presence of something great, bigger than ourselves. That's a lesson I hope that I never forget, no matter what I end up doing, that I never lose that awe. So that's a little bit about the background behind that photo and why it's probably one of the best photos I've ever taken.
And I love this set of photos. I like a lot of your different photos. Really, very briefly, I want to share a photo that I think is haunting. This is from your time in Auschwitz.
Yeah, that's one of the starvation cells in block 11, and that's actually, I think this was probably the cell that I believe Maximilian Kobe was in that Saint Kobe was in that cell as well. And so, yeah, without going into much detail, I think the starvation cell is exactly what it's supposed to be. Also, unfortunately, we learned that before Auschwitz-Birkenau opened, they were actually gassing prisoners inside of those cells. So many people died in that. But that was something I thought was rather fascinating and haunting. Took the photo, and that's one of those pesky little photos that kind of sticks with you. That you know it's easy. It is so easy to yeah, it's easy to look at what's happening even in today's world and throw on and prescribe certain terms like, "Oh, this is Nazism, this is fascism," and exchange humanity for ideas. And I
Yeah.
think that there's a danger when you do that. And I think this kind of photo reminds me that they're behind these ideas that we expound upon, whether we say that our ideas are better than another person's ideas or so forth, we're talking about human beings at the end of the day, and we're talking about
Yeah.
very human consequences. So that's what that photo reminds me of.
And it's profound because this is graffiti on a cement wall. a cinder block wall. And that means these people are expending a great deal of energy to make sure that something of them and their humanity remains by putting their names in here, by scratching into these hard stones. And that's
Mhm,
profound to me. They do not want to be forgotten, even though yeah, if you think about that, the person that's
mhm.
on the other side of that, the ghost, if you will. So if I can, I just with this photo up here, and I'm going to keep sharing photos for a few minutes. I want to talk about the spiritual impact of, or the, I maybe let's talk about the intersection rather. You've said that every person is made in the image and likeness of God. That's something that we hold as Orthodox Christians.
Mhm,
And then you said every photo I take of someone is considered sacred in my book. I think there's something sacred here about the ghosts that are not
mhm.
showing up. Can I ask you about some places that you've been where you felt like you were capturing people in the image of God in maybe ways that would challenge other people's perspective on who gets to be that image bearer?
Yeah, I could discuss that. First thing I'll mention about why I feel it's important to note why I think that photos are capturing the image of God.
Yeah.
I like to use this metaphor right off the bat. I walk into your house and I take a photo of you and your husband, throw it on the floor, urinate on it. That's probably not going to solicit a really good emotional response. So, despite what my Protestant upbringing has been regarding the use of images and the reverencing of images, I have to say that probably human beings, part of the human part of the human experience is actually whether we like it or not conditioning ourselves to respond to images. And that
Mm,
part of the emotional response is, I show you a photo of POTUS.
yeah.
Probably not going to elicit a good response. Whereas I show somebody a photo of Mother Teresa, that's a good response. So we as humans are conditioned to responding. And, despite what the rational, enlightened people in this world say that, oh, I don't, we do. We do. And I think the example I just gave kind of proves it. So I kind of want to answer that question by noting that regardless of whether we think we're that rational or not, and we don't need stimuli to elicit emotion, we do. That being said, in terms of the image of God, you asked me that question a while back, and I said I would have to say it was at the Pride events, especially, one thing that people were really surprised about was that one of the reasons why there's so many photos of Pride was because I had actually been invited by the board. So, going back to kind of my brag moment that I'm not a good journalist, but I'm a halfway decent one, is that, you're getting people from the far right who are inviting you for interviews to interview them, but you're also getting people left that are inviting you to cover their stuff. You kind of have a reputation for being fair, and that I hope never goes away. And I think it will never go away because whether I was looking at, you know, a you know, a candidate who was primarying another candidate who's very much a MAGA Republican, or whether I was
Mhm.
looking at somebody who was, you know, we were in the middle of drag shows. But if you're at a drag show, the person that you're photographing, two things. I always wanted to make sure that I presented them at the best of light, and
Yeah.
because they were at the end of the day, I agree or I disagree with you, you're still human. And so that was something that transcends ideology, is reminding myself that I was still looking at a human being. And as somebody who has a camera, who has the means to archive and to observe, is my responsibility to remind the public, present them the facts about that person, but to remind the public that that person is a human being, whether I like them or not. So
Yeah.
I think it was
I
probably it wasn't so much the pride thing, but it was also I think it was a set of events. It was the fact that 2 weeks, I interview lieutenant governor, but 2 weeks prior, I'm at a vigil for Alex Purdy and Nicole Good, and the fact that I was able to convey and portray both of those moments with the same amount of dignity and respect, even though they represent very different ends of the spectrum. I think that kind of was something that really stuck with me that, "Hey, dude, you're getting the hang of this. This is what you're about." And so that I hope answers your question, kind of a roundabout way, but hopefully I answered it.
very much so. I was going to go and see if I could pull up those pride pictures. You've taken thousands, and anybody who wants to follow you can find you. Do you mind if I share your
Yeah,
your
yeah, sure, go for it.
photography? Okay, Feral Historian and Photographer on Facebook, and it's a great place to see the depth and breadth of everything that you've covered. Because actually, I'm being reminded as I go through your page, I'm like, everything. We had an international motocross in our little town, and you captured that so well. You've captured, I believe there was something with the Sikhs in Indianapolis. Yeah, so I'm gonna bring this into the screen just to give people an idea of just like if you just pulled
Oh,
his page up, here's some
I'd
of these.
forgotten. I'd forgotten I'd taken that many photos. I
Yeah,
remember
this is
the
one.
motocross one because I had to call my wife that evening, and I quit drinking back in 23, and but I mean there was just so much alcohol at that event, and I had to call my wife that night and tell her, hey, I wasn't drinking, but if I come home smelling like, basically if I smell like diesel fuel and beer and shame, please understand that it wasn't me. But that was up close and personal, and that was a one of the things I think that was reminded of when especially when I look at the photos of the parade, was it reminded me that for a place like Crawfordsville that basically sits on very diametrically opposite ends of the pole, somewhat more progressive in the academic world and in the community when it's faced a very progressive community and a very conservative, region.
Yeah,
That, man, what an amazing experience. For 3 or 4 hours, we got to put that all aside and we got to say, this is cool. And I think that I remember when Mayor Barton was giving his State of the City address, he made a comment to the fact that for hours we were able to put our differences aside and become one world.
yeah. This is
So
it, and it was beautiful. And then you have also, like you said, taken some pictures from the gerrymandering in the state house. That was really quite a whole experience for you. You spent
oh
countless
yeah.
hours in our state house, and I want to bring up some of those as well, if I can, because again, you're talking about across the spectrum of everything, right? So the opportunity, and these photos capture this as well. We've got our lieutenant governor. Hang on, I'm going to bring this into the screen
Yes.
as the vote counts are coming in, right? You
I
have
just
one
remember
that
the explosion of emotion that happened when those came up and when people were were tallying the votes. Nobody wanted to be there. Everybody was unhappy. And I mean, one thing to kind of keep in mind, I remember from that day, and I wanted to be there because I didn't want somebody else's interpretation to be the official interpretation. Arrogantly, I wanted a trained historian in that room, and that just happened to be me. So I didn't want to see headlines of being, oh, Trump's thing was stifled. No, a good headline is basically that the resolution failed. Not saying this is this ideology or not trying to build around a pro or anti-Trump ideology, but saying, hey, this is an event. It happened.
yeah.
This is what happened to it. I will let the public figure out whether what happened that day was a good or a bad thing. But I could say that I was in the room, and so whenever anybody else has an opinion of it, I can say, okay, that's what I experienced that day. Yes, I remember that because the moment the vote finished, I was actually near the exit. I ran out the back door and took that set of photos of everybody.
These are great photos, and they're the two different sides. And you know what this comes down to? I mean, if we could depoliticize it, it's really about not gerrymandering. It's really not about being able to say we're going to make less competitive districts, which I think if we're champions of democracy, and I am, this is a great set of photos because that day was so historic in its own
Yeah,
way, right?
if you look at like the day, well, one of the things I'm always conscious of is that the legislature is probably one of the most amazing branches of government, but it's also one of the most fragile. When you notice when you look at the Declaration of Independence that one of the grievances, almost like right at the top, is something to the effect that King George has been either dissolving legislatures or he
Right.
is calling legislators at strange hours in distant places away from their repositories of public record. That's a paraphrase. But the fact that
Yeah.
two of the 27 grievances had to do, at least two of them, I forget all of the other ones, had to do with the legislature and the fact that this involved a reconfiguration of that legislature. I think, well, okay, I don't think that we've learned our lesson. This is a sad thing to say because when primaries, okay, this is 23, Spencer Deere and Paula Copenhaver, who I've had the privilege of meeting both of them face to face and speaking with both of them, interviewing them, and it's been an honor of a lifetime to be able to be that guy in the room doing those things. But when you look at the district itself, I think there's only like 650, was it? No, it would have been about 13, maybe 13 or 14,000 people voted. And please don't tell, I mean, Park County is about 17,000. Please don't tell me that we all, that, please don't tell me that we didn't. I don't think that we care enough. And this is proof, really, when you think about it, when you compare the photos that I took on that day versus the numbers that came up through the midterms. I don't think we as Americans have actually learned our lesson, how dangerous this is, how dangerous it is to, I wouldn't say dangerous, but how important it is that we pay attention to what's happening in our legislatures. And no, yeah, I think after it wasn't so much whether they voted for or against, certain ideologies. It was more the fact that it wasn't so much what they voted for, but who voted for it, and who is not very many people. We did,
Right.
and that's something that is kind of discouraging.
Yeah, we could go off into this conversation about what does it take to be an engaged citizen, right? And history is such an important part of this. I think history, when you bring out these little tidbits, as you've done throughout the course of this entire interview, surprising little things most people don't know, they start to think, oh, there's something to be mined there. I just learned a thing and maybe I should be more engaged. But in our information age, it's so incredibly difficult to weed through everything. You know me, I go through all the bills most every January before a
You
session,
do.
and there's thousands of them. It's very difficult to go, okay, which ones do we think are going to be paid attention to? Which ones do we think are going to be advanced? And then of course you have to follow, there's everybody has a different interest group. So you follow your different interest groups and they tell you which bills they think are going to last and where they stand. And you know what's interesting is that our editor, because we both write for the same paper, shared with me just recently that a bill that the Indiana Hoosier
State
newspaper
Press Association.
State Press Association, thank you. Yeah. They had gone and testified and they thought they killed this bill. And at the last second, those same representatives shoved that piece of legislation into another piece of legislation and ended
Yeah.
up getting it passed. And
Mhm.
it's going to be devastating for newspapers, especially small newspapers like the ones we write for.
Yeah, that's the establishment of the public. I forget, it's HB 13 something, but it was establishing a public notice database because for all intents and purposes throughout time of memorial, one of the basic ways of getting news out to people and one of the basic, revenue generators for newspapers was actually the public news was announcing things in publicly announcing things through newspapers. That's how it's been. I mean, if you're wanting to divorce decree, custody hearings and so forth, those are actually published, and that's considered a legal
Yeah.
requirement. In this state, that is a legal requirement. You want
Yep.
to take somebody to court for alimony, you have to publish that that is actually occurring in a newspaper. But now with the creation of a public state-run database, it kind of took newspapers out of the equation, so fewer people are going to need to read them. So that could be an interesting thing. And the irony is that, I mean, even I think it was that month Todd Young had just said that the biggest threat to democracy is the loss of small newspapers. Well, you're not doing anything to help it either. So
Nope.
and yeah, that happens more often than not. I mean, there was a bill about child safety on the internet using school issued devices. That bill got killed, but the actual provision ended up being thrust into a different bill. So the- these things do happen, and it is hard to do it. But also, I think that's where we need to be very good as journalists is to keep up to date with these kind of things. And that's where journalists need to really lean in and be honest, because there's so much more to report on. But our integrity also, for many good reasons, is is at stake as well. So there's very interesting, and the news landscape will be very different even next year than it is this year.
Yep, it's changing fast, sometimes too fast. We've talked about a lot, and I think that just comes from being people of with a great deal of interests, broad interests, if you will. I want to ask you. You sent me some lovely photos, and you do not have to bring up a photo, but I want to know if there's an experience that has in your photography or even in your history time, or let me not put too many boundaries in it, but an experience that has shifted the way that you see the world. And that'll be my last question for you.
Yeah, actually, there was one. That was you touched. There were actually two
Cool.
instances that I'll mention. Instance number one was very much when I realized how powerful my camera really was. I often joke
Mhm.
that there's only one person that the police will ever say don't shoot to. That would be a journalist. But it was a photo that I took of Martin Luther King Jr. the third. Now, I had been
Mm,
asked to be his photographer for that day during that last phase of the Selma to Montgomery March. He was marching with a woman by the name of Cheyenne Webb Christinger. who at 6 years old was the youngest survivor of Bloody Sunday. She eventually finished the march with King. And interestingly enough, once King realized that there was a 6-year-old in the crowd, he babysat her for an hour and called her parents and said, hey, dude, you gotta come get your kid. But seeing her and MLK Jr.'s son in the marching that day during that last part there, I wish I'd sent the photo to you now. But I think it was very interesting that because there had been multiple death threats at the group. In fact, if you look closely at the background of the photo, mid-ground of the photo, there are 4 armored SUVs in front of us. And I asked one of the bodyguards because it was 3 state troopers, 2 personal bodyguards, and an FBI agent that were actually in the bodyguarding detail. But I asked the FBI agent, like, hey, bud, if this happens, what do we do? He said, when those doors opened up, just jump right in, don't ask questions. Oh, this will be fun. I can't wait. I'll tell you what, once we walked into downtown Montgomery, my back was itching. But the photo's powerful. It's an amazing photo because also in the foreground is the Alabama Capitol where George Wallace gave his speech about segregation now, segregation forever. And also Jefferson Davis had been sworn in, and the road that we were traveling had been on the inauguration parade route for that Confederacy that Confederate president inauguration. So that's when I realized, hey, this camera can make a political statement. This camera's powerful. That was when that really felt good. And also I think when it got me out of my little traumatic funk. How photography had changed. There's a place called the Barn, and this would actually be where Emmett Till was tortured and beaten to death. The description of what the state that they found his body in was not a good one. I can't share it here, but it's definitely not something you'd want to be discussing too much. But what it was interesting was a Google Maps. Now, originally I was going to go to the barn. Google Maps sent me in through the back way. Well, here's the problem. I got stuck in the mud. This is the Mississippi Delta. And so I have to make the walk of shame from my car about 0.6 miles from my car to the farmer's house. All the time, the barn is actually in front of me. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm screwed. Like this is not going to end well for me. This is going to be a really bad day. No, this is not going to happen. Wife actually called the farmer over, and he was really cool. And first thing he says, "Are you some sort of one of those social justice people?" I said, "No, actually, I'm just a tourist today. I'm just here hobnobbing." And he said, "Yeah, let's just get you out of here." He was the kindest man ever. And I made sure this time around when I went through Mississippi that he got a thank you gift card to the Arby's in the nearby town. But I think that we've changed over 100 years. I mean, not 100 years. I think his death was in the 50s. It's been over 70 years. I think that we still have a long ways to go. I believe that in our founding documents and in our principles, we have hard baked into us kind of the programming, the coding, so to speak, for change, and that's why I still believe in America. But I saw it that day. I mean, just the fact that a minority could show up where another minority 70 years ago, and I think it was 70 years ago that week that he had been beaten to death. 70 years later, another person can show up and get a very, very different treatment and welcome than the last time somebody was in that barn. I think that really changed how I view things, and that more than anything, to my listeners out there, I would have hope. I mean, I know it's hard, and I know that the media tends to prey on emotions. We're the wise, we do. Gotta get those clicks, gotta get those likes. But I think if you kind of pull away from all of that and just look at the big picture, look at the 70-year picture, have faith that it's going to be different. And what you do today, you may never see the results. But understand that in the grand scheme of history, I won't see what my photos will do, but I know they'll do good. You may not see what you're doing right now, but you got to have faith that it will do good. And that kind of faith is what gives me energy. And that kind of being able as a historian to look at the trajectory of America to see that we recognize that we have problems. We may or may not deal with them in my lifetime, but I believe that they will be dealt with. That's the hope that I have, and that's the joy that I carry with me as a Christian. So, yeah,
That's
that was a
excellent.
long, that was a really long answer.
It was a great answer. It goes back to like everybody wants change really fast, but so often it does take it takes patience and it takes the willingness. Maybe this is what faith is, the willingness to hope for that which you will not see.
I don't think I don't believe I'm gonna see. Like I said, I'm writing for some nerdy archivist 90 years from now. I'll be dead, but I'll be gone by then. We didn't I bet you most of the people at Stonewall weren't alive to see Hodges Oberforce back in 2015. So
Right.
we won't be here, but we have to have faith that we're doing the right thing. And that takes intrinsic motive. But I think that also comes from studying history. So that's the point, that's the purpose of history at this point in time, is it kind of gives people faith that the trajectory still is pretty good.
Andy, this is awesome. Thank you so much. I can't wait to share this with everyone. I think that everyone should listen. So I'll be putting the links into the show notes just to give people an idea of how to get to the Ernie Pyle Museum, how to get to candles, how to fund your photography, and just to also follow along if they want to read online. You can go to the paper of Montgomery County, usually published on Mondays.
Yeah, I have a column. It's called it's about the dorkiest title column that you can have, which is America 250, an immigrant's Odyssey, American 250 Odyssey, an immigrant's guide to the Americas. But I like to
It's well worth
include
the
things.
read.
Well, I like to include things that most people have never heard of. And if you look at some of those stories are pretty bizarre, but I mean, I won't pretty much every photo there, unless it's an antique photo, was a photo that I took.
I appreciate you spending time with Examined. If it gave you something to think about, subscribe on Substack. It's free. Or follow on YouTube or Spotify. And if it resonated, leave a rating and share with a friend.